which first met in 2009, represents an ongoing effort by academics, program directors, administrators, environmental agency personnel, and practitioners to produce a living set of consensus-based recommendations concerning the pedagogical and administrative aspects of interdisciplinary and higher order sustainability education. The Roundtable's vision is the emergence of societies that facilitate, enhance, and sustain indefinitely in that facilitated or enhanced state the well-being of human individuals, their communities, their environments, while the pedagogical goal, is to empower learners to contribute to the realization of that vision. There will be a third part of this series next month, which will cover the administration and evaluation of the SHES programs. The first installment that you saw on the screen before covered the basics and background of the SHES Roundtable and its approach. Very quickly now, our first presenter will be Paul Barresi, who is professor of political science and environmental law in the School of Arts and Sciences at Southern New Hampshire University in Manchester, New Hampshire. He also holds a part-time appointment as adjunct professor of law at the Sun Yat-sen University of Law in, and Paul, you'll have to correct me, in Guangzhou, China, where he was Fulbright lecturer in law in spring 2016. He holds degrees from Cornell University, from GW University, and from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where he was a Ford Foundation Fellow. His PhD is from Boston University, where he was a Presidential University Graduate Fellow. His research focuses on how legal, political, and other institutions and cultures shape environmental law and its effectiveness as a strategy for building sustainable societies, using China, India, Russia, and the United States as illustrative examples. After Paul's presentation, we will hear from Kimberly Reiter. And for those who are on the line, please do mute your lines for the recording quality. We are getting a little bit of feedback. Kimberly is Associate Professor of History at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida. Her scholarship focuses on the historiography of Romanization and the differing perceptions of Romanization as a measurement of Roman involvement and agency, with special attention to Romans in Britain. As a scholar of early England, she's very active in student field projects and has directed the Stetson Field Course on the early English landscape since 1998. She has received awards for her teaching, including the President's Award for Innovation and Collaboration from the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences. She has extensive experience in designing and teaching courses in environmental history, environmental issues, and the teaching of environmental issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. So with that, as brief as possible introduction, I want to turn it over without further delay to Paul Baresi, who will share his presentation with us. Paul, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. The first question I have is, do you see the GoToMeeting pop-up box on your screen or not? Ira?
I do not.
Okay. So, proponents of various approaches to sustainability education have offered various pedagogical strategies to implement those approaches. The strategies in this presentation are uniquely well suited to implementing the Sustainable Human and Environmental Systems approach, or SHES approach, to sustainability education in the classroom, because most of them emerge more or less organically in the course of trying to implement that approach in a highly experimental introductory sustainability course at SNHU that I've been teaching for a number of years. What I'd like to present is essentially extracted from the book, the cover of which you see in the bottom of your screen. The presentation is mostly highlights from chapter 7 there on the left, but with reference to parts of Chapter 5. Chapter 5, which was one of the subjects of the previous webinar, the contents of that chapter, is a mixture of the highly theoretical and the very practical. Chapter 7 is very much a nuts and bolts chapter. They're both about doing sustainability and teaching sustainability, although Chapter 5 really purports to be about doing, so it's explicitly about doing, but implicitly about teaching. Chapter 7 is explicitly about teaching, implicitly about doing. We could have broken things down a little bit differently, but that's the way it worked out. Because I'm drawing from these two different parts of the snapshot of our work, this presentation is essentially a teaser. Really what we're doing here, or what I'm doing here, is we're zipping along at about 10,000 feet, clipping off the peaks of the highest mountains in a very extensive range of mountains. And so in that respect, it's just a little taste, really, of much more extensive work, and work that has continued after the publication of the book, which is a snapshot that's now, well, about a year and a half, maybe old from the time it was began working on the drafts. So the strategies in this presentation are relevant to phases of the first two stages of the SHES approach, each of which entails various phases, tasks, and subtasks. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at versions of a couple of flowcharts that appear in the book of the first two stages of the SHES approach. The diamonds are the stages, the circles are phases of the stages, the rectangles are tasks within the phases, and the oblongs are subtasks of the tasks. So in the first stage of this approach, students learn how to diagnose sustainability challenges posed by what we call sustainability situations, these sets of facts out there in the world that are of concern for what people think are sustainability reasons. In the first phase of this stage, students learn how to recognize what we call circumstances of concern, these sets of facts that are of concern to some set of stakeholders, as sustainability situations. In the second phase, students learn how to reveal the complexity of sustainability situations using systems thinking. In the second stage of the SHES approach, students learn how to prescribe sustainable responses to sustainability challenges that are posed by the sustainability situations. In the first phase of this stage, they learn how to envision sustainable alternatives to those sustainability situations. In the second phase, they learn how to reveal the complexity of those sustainable alternatives using systems thinking. And then in the third phase, students learn how to envision interventions that would transform the sustainability situations into the sustainable alternatives, again using systems thinking. There is a third stage to the approach. It's about implementing the sustainable alternatives, but that third stage is beyond the scope of this presentation. Now, what I want to do here is to look briefly at 5 especially useful pedagogical strategies in the context of the SHES approach. The first strategy is robust framing. And robust framing is a strategy for conceptualizing 2 things. Now, frame in this sense is a very specific term. It refers to a cognitive device, or the cognitive device, used by individuals to interpret and to organize experience. Robust framing is based on an adaptation of the questions that are asked and answered by journalists gathering facts for news stories. It's the who, what, when, where, why, and how set of questions, but they're adapted in a way that makes them especially useful in sustainability context. Robust framing can be useful pedagogically in the first phase of each of the first 2 stages of the SHES approach. It's there that students develop their initial conceptions of circumstances of concern on the one hand, and on the other hand, putatively sustainable alternatives to sustainability situations for use later in the SHES approach. So this robust framing sets the stage for what's included in their conceptions of what's happening out there in the world and what they would like to happen in the future. Robust framing sets the pedagogical stage for assessing well-being holistically in crucial tasks of the same phase. And as you know from the first webinar or from Ira's brief description of what went on there, this concept of well-being is well-being of human individuals, of their communities, and their environments is at the center of the conception of sustainability with which the Roundtable has been working. Now, the second especially useful pedagogical strategy is assessing consistency with sustainability. It's a very simple method for bundling together the role of stakeholder values and their implications for the well-being of these three groups, human individuals, human communities, human environments, into a three-dimensional qualitative metric that can be used to confirm two things. Assessing consistency with sustainability makes completing this task possible by deconstructing into a matrix the sustainability concept implicit in the vision of the SHES approach to sustainability education. So we have this SHES vision with a lot of moving parts. All this table is a deconstruction of those parts in a way that students can work through step by step so that they capture the entire vision in their concept of sustainability in deciding whether the circumstance with which stakeholders are concerned does in fact pose sustainability challenges, how serious they are, what kind they are, and whether or not the sustainable alternatives that they're proposing meet the criterion of being consistent with this SHES vision of sustainable societies. Any circumstance of concern that impedes or diminishes the well-being of human individuals, their communities, or their environments qualifies as what we call a sustainability situation because it poses at least one sustainability challenge. Any putatively sustainable alternative to a sustainability situation that would do anything other than facilitate or enhance that well-being does not qualify as a sustainable one. And the rest of consistency with sustainability, that concept is merely a matter of degree. So our goal is to sustain these positive impacts on well-being, enhancement or facilitation indefinitely, but the reality is circumstances of concern can fall short of that goal, as can putatively sustainable alternatives to a sustainability situation. So we need at least a qualitative way of figuring out where we are with respect to this sustainability yardstick in assessing what's happening in circumstances of concern, whether they do in fact pose sustainability challenges, if so, how serious they are, and whether what we think will be sustainable alternatives to the sustainability situations that pose those challenges will in fact be sustainable, and how consistent with sustainability they will be. Assessments of consistency with sustainability can be useful pedagogically in certain phases of the first two stages of the SHES approach. It's there that students must decide whether a given circumstance of concern qualifies as a sustainability situation, or whether a given putatively sustainable alternative to a sustainability situation qualifies as a sustainable one. Assessments of consistency with sustainability give students a very simple tool for qualitatively comparing sustainability situations with sustainable alternatives and for qualitatively comparing sustainable alternatives with each other. The third and fourth especially useful pedagogical strategies are systemic resolution and systemic synthesis. Systemic resolution is an analytical systems thinking strategy. The solid lines here indicate the systems that are or could be the focus of attention. Systemic synthesis is essentially the opposite of systemic resolution. And again, the solid lines here indicate systems that are or could be the focus of attention. Systemic resolution and systemic synthesis can be useful pedagogically in teaching students how to perform certain tasks and subtasks in certain phases of the first two stages of the SHES approach. And it's in these many tasks and subtasks that students begin thinking about diagnosing and prescribing effective responses to sustainability challenges in systems thinking terms. So there is a point in this SHES strategy where students make that transition from thinking about circumstances of concern in terms that are not necessarily based on systems thinking, and then they have to make that shift because it's the systems thinking that really provides that holism that the roundtable was after. And it's here in these various tasks and subtasks where they do that. In general, there are three ways in which systemic resolution and systemic synthesis can be useful pedagogically, depending on the tasks or subtasks of the SHES approach in which they're being used. So the first way is that they can help students to learn how to reveal the systemic interaction of complexity of sustainability situations and sustainable alternatives to those sustainability situations in general. And one of the things that task includes is linking together conceptually isolated system interactions in a single network after students first conceptualize the essential elements of a robust frame of a sustainability situation or a sustainable alternative in systems thinking terms. In the context of performing the same, on one slide behind, so it's here that they do that. This is where they make that transition from thinking in terms that are not necessarily based on systems thinking to systems thinking. And they have to kind of knit together these various systems that they're conceptualizing into a single network to provide that holism that the roundtable is looking for. In the context of performing the same and one other task in this approach, systemic resolution and systemic synthesis can help students to learn how to reveal drivers. So a driver in our conception is any interaction between two systems that causes or facilitates or enhances or transforms an interaction between one of those systems and a third system. The drivers of interest to us include not only drivers that make sustainability situations and sustainable alternatives what they are, but also drivers, the ones that would be needed to transform sustainability situations into sustainable alternatives. And the third way in which systemic synthesis and systemic resolution can be useful pedagogically is in the strategic conceptual scaling of the systemic and interactional complexity that have been revealed by these tasks that I've just been mentioning. So for example, consider a sustainability challenge to human individual well-being involving the exposure of industrial workers to a hazardous substance. Is it more useful strategically to conceptualize the system interactions out of which this sustainability challenge flows directly at a molecular level or a whole body level, keeping in mind that later on in this approach, the students are going to have to propose interventions to transform the sustainability situation into a sustainable alternative. The fifth especially useful pedagogical strategy is system network mapping. It's a way of representing systemic and interactional complexity of sustainability situations and sustainable alternatives graphically. Now, although any set of graphic conventions agreed upon by a given group of students and their instructors will do, some conventions are more likely to facilitate communication than others. This map uses the following conventions, for example. So circles are either systems or categories of systems, with green for environmental systems and colors drawn from the yellow spectrum for human systems. The arrows are interactions, with the thickness varying in accordance with the relative degree of influence of those interactions on the systems being influenced, and with the associated pluses and minuses indicating either synergistic or antagonistic interactions. And then the HI, the HC, and the HE, they indicate system interactions that have impacts on human individual, community, and environmental well-being, with the associated pluses and minuses indicating whether the impact is positive or negative. Now, a very simple set of conventions, but conventions that in the context of this approach are almost intuitively obvious and really go a long way toward making it possible for the instructor and the students to communicate effectively about some pretty abstract and rarefied concepts. Now, system network mapping can be useful pedagogically whenever students are required to think in systems thinking terms. It is required in various tasks and subtasks in certain phases of the first two stages of the SHES approach. So in all these phases and tasks and subtasks that you see highlighted here, students are required to think in systems thinking terms, because it's that systems thinking that provides them with a holism that the Roundtable was after in this approach. And system network mapping emerged pretty quickly in this experimental course as really the only way to communicate effectively about sustainability, both circumstances of concern, sustainability situations, sustainable alternatives in a systems thinking way. Systems network mapping is an indispensable means of communicating in the classroom in systems thinking terms, but it does have some weaknesses. One weakness, for example, is the difficulty of distinguishing clearly between systems and categories of systems in these system network maps. Now, in the variant of the approach on which I've been working since we began work on this book, which has gone quite a bit beyond the very simple things that we're talking about. We've developed some conventions for dealing with these various issues, including this one, which is not represented here. But representing every system in a given category by its own circle is usually not practical. And it emerged pretty quickly as kind of a conceptual stumbling block, because preserving the conceptual distinction between systems and categories of systems is very important when using systemic resolution and systemic synthesis to reveal the systemic and interactional complexity of sustainability situations and sustainable alternatives, to avoid creating logical fallacies. And we've done that, and we've done some other things regarding how one represents the various principles and concepts that we're working with in this approach that aren't represented here. But it's an ongoing project, and we're moving forward. So that's all I have for you today. I do have to leave, but it's really been a pleasure being part of the webinar.
Thank you, Paul. We understand you need to leave, and we'll have Kimberly and perhaps others from the SHES group available to answer questions about the SHES approach as we move toward the end of today's presentation. With that, Kimberly, I'm making you the presenter. So lovely. Hopefully you can find the prompt box that will allow you to put your slides up. Yes, I'm seeing them. And the floor is yours.
Why, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I am not a STEM person, and I was asked whether for the example on how to use this pedagogy in an undergraduate course for a non-STEM class, I would be willing to put this into one of my classes, and I agreed to try it in a course that I teach and am currently teaching on Stonehenge. So I'm going to take you through how this works in a course beyond your typical STEM. Stonehenge is a fun class. It's the monument is a creature of environmental relationships we'll never fully understand. The upper level course that I am teaching was designed as what we call a micro history, and it uses techniques developed in new approaches to sustainability education, including a holistic superdisciplinary methodology that introduces students to the use of systemic resolution to reveal the systemic and interactional complexity of a sustainability situation in a very specific physical and temporal context. Utilizing an examination of the environmental and human history of the Salisbury Plain through 9,000 years, students are introduced to systemic resolution, systemic synthesis, temporal thinking, social learning, all the various things that Paul just told you something about, as well as diverse alternatives to sustainability situations. The course combines archaeological, environmental, historic, religious, social, and folkloric data to explore both a dynamic prehistoric landscape and a modern cultural focal point in sustainability and ownership. So what are the elements of a superdisciplinary landscape microhistory of the Salisbury Plain? Well, first of all, we see the Salisbury Plain people and the communities whose well-being is connected to the sustainability of the historic and environmental aspects of the plain. Second, we see the system interactions, in the case of Stonehenge, both temporal and current, that facilitate or enhance the well-being of the historic and current individuals, their communities, and their environments in the Salisbury Plain Global Heritage Site, and the benefits and challenges that accrue locally from that distinction. And finally, we're seeing the system interactions that would result from alternative strategies of open access in an environment that's deemed both ecologically and structurally fragile, especially when the region has been historically open to anyone who wanted to visit or had spiritual needs until rather recently. So, how do we apply this SHES approach? First, we have to have a holistic and superdisciplinary consideration of the present sustainability situation and the sustainability challenge at hand. The students got to be able to understand how the complicated relationships and interactions of a system's parts constitute the whole, and how to study these complex phenomena beyond single discipline-based theories and methods. We also have to have an understanding of systemic resolution and systemic synthesis, as Paul explained, for revealing the systemic and interactional complexity of the sustainability solutions surrounding Stonehenge. Students, by the end of this course, should be able to resolve a complex temporal system conceptually into a network of interacting subsystems, and conceptually synthesize from a set of interacting systems a more inclusive, complex system. We would hope that students could recognize the existence of systems in the Salisbury Plain and show an understanding of both how the subsystems interact within the broader and complex supersystem, and how such a supersystem is synthesized from the subsystems. The students must demonstrate the ability to engage in future thinking in the context of the course, to picture alternative futures and pathways to those futures. In a robust framing of the subject, the long, non-cyclical history of the plain's use must be considered before students can ask questions of current sustainability. One can also backcast by creatively envisioning a desirable, sustainable state for the plain and its monuments, and then determine the steps needed to reach that state. And finally, the course must utilize social learning. An application of social learning in this case involves an investigation of the controversies that have arisen over control of the Salisbury Plain's future. The student during the course encounters a diversity of actors and agencies involved in questions of sustainability, management, and community engagement. Students are currently engaging in discussions of the interactions among authoritative, academic, environmental, local, and alternative voices, and will evaluate whether such discussions have led to active transformation of policy concerning the role of a diverse community in the sustainable management of Stonehenge. And finally, students will propose better approaches to social learning that might bring in more perspectives and peripheral agencies. So any comprehensive approach to something like this is by by necessity, superdisciplinary. We bring in archaeology, obviously. Currently, we're building Stonehenge one rock at a time. It's got to bring in environmental issues, engineering, history, religious studies, folkloric data with landscape studies, and social anthropology. Peel back the layers over the centuries and to explore a location that represents both a dynamic British prehistory and a modern cultural focal point. So we ask all sorts of questions in the course of the semester. What could happen depending on open or closed access to Stonehenge with regard to the goal of preserving a unique landscape? And it is indeed unique. There is nothing else like Stonehenge anywhere. There are other megalithic landscapes in Britain and in Ireland, but Stonehenge in many ways is a globally unique spot. How do we allow visitors to feel like they have access while protecting a monument that has no parallel? What's the time frame over which the various decisions at Stonehenge were made? The landscape decisions, where to site Stonehenge, and the over 700 other monuments in the Stonehenge area. What were the ritual decisions? What was the locational significance and understanding its meaning, both in the long history of Stonehenge, which goes back, as I said, close to 9,000 years, and in the present? Who was responsible for its construction? Who's responsible today for its sustainability? How are agencies and individuals responding to the Salisbury Plain's continued sustainability in the wake of massive visitor numbers? Let's face it, if you've never been to Britain, Stonehenge is on your bucket list. Everybody seems to go there, and they have to know how to manage that in terms of sustainability, but also give the visitors the satisfaction of seeing Stonehenge. And why are the responsible agencies and individuals so deeply involved in the debate about controlled or open access to this environmentally unique site? And how are they directing the debate? In playing around with this, we have to look at 4 interacting networks of topographical, constructed, social, and spiritual subsystems. The topographical is pretty obvious from the map that you see in front of you. This is a rolling plain. Why did the people who built all of those monuments that you see in front of you, every single dot, every single dash is a monument, what were they thinking of in terms of the landscape that confronted them? Why did they construct what they did, and where? Socially, what did it mean to them? Spiritually, what did it mean to them? All of these are subsystems, but again, they need to be resynthesized at the end of the course. The topographical subsystems are the geological underlay of the chalk with flints, the geography of the Salisbury Plain, the physical landscape of the plain itself. And then you've got the various constructed subsystems, Stonehenge as we think it would have looked like, Stonehenge as it looks like today, the various created monuments all across the Salisbury Plain, and the relationship to each other, including the posited astronomical and physical alignments and the fascination today with archaeoastronomy and archaeomathematics that may or may not have contributed to the spiritual and social systems in the past, but certainly do so today, with the belief in connective lines of power that we call ley lines, or the linkages to various monuments, either in terms of some great archaeological computer or what have you. And then you've got the social subsystems, the community itself that builds these monuments on the plain, the economic systems that sustained these monuments, the migratory subsystems of people coming to this area. All of these activities intersected on the Salisbury Plain. And then, of course, the spiritual subsystems, symbolic, cultic, mortuary, folkloric, the subsystems of mentality. How do we think about these things? All of these attached to the Salisbury Plain. So we scale the course over the semester. Obviously, they want to know something about Stonehenge itself. So we ask about Stonehenge and its landscape. Students are asked to propose a rationale for the unusual prehistoric activity in the area based on a physical assessment of the plain. We look at the historiography, in other words, the scholarship that has been done on Stonehenge in days past, much more of it environmental in the past 50 years. We look at systemic resolution, the robust framing of this sustainability situation of the Salisbury Plain. We peel back the various layers, starting from when the ice recedes, from the Mesolithic into the Neolithic, into the Bronze Age. We look at the Great Henge, which we are currently starting to put together, and in about a month the students will be using human volunteers to build a human Stonehenge so they can put into practice what they've been learning about the mathematics of the henge. We look at the various interpretations of Stonehenge. We look at the Salisbury Plain after the Great Henge. The Druids, who had absolutely nothing to do with Stonehenge as far as we know, but obviously saw it and may have used it even if they didn't build it. The Romans, who were there even though they leave no message of what they saw into it, and the various medieval cultures were the first to mention this. We also look at the drivers of spiritualism, the Druidomania that started in the 18th century, environmentalist movements, tourism movements, development. We then start to look at managing the Stonehenge landscape today. Students address the modern usage of the plain, the issues of nearby military, agricultural, residential, tourism development in the face of environmental fragility, the preservation needs, the popular protest over interpretation and common rights, the reactions to the new environmental protections afforded by the Stonehenge project, and the new award-winning visitor center that you can see over to the left of the overhead that you see there. Please note that it is quite a ways from Stonehenge itself. You can walk it, but most people take the lovely trolley. Where you see the icon in the lower right-hand corner where it says north, that's where the parking lot used to be. But they are trying to take into account the various usages of this plain, including the tourism and how you're going to sustain all of this. And then finally, they look at resolving the complexity of Stonehenge. Students discuss how the conflict between protection and access is a common conundrum that involves environmental, social, religious, and economic considerations, all of which must be taken into account and periodically re-examined. So the learning outcomes are to align with the essential learning outcomes of the SHES approach of the sustainability education. We hope, at least I hope, that by the end of the semester, these students can explain these interactions, take a look at the spiritual, social, and environmental systems present on the Salisbury Plain historically, currently constituting a sustainability situation that can only be considered holistically. I hope that they can resolve the Salisbury Plain into a network of interacting spiritual, economic, geographical, social, environmental, and environmentalist and political subsystems, just a few of these, and then to synthesize from this network of interacting subsystems the Salisbury Plain supersystem, to show the systemic and interactional complexity of the sustainability situation that revolves around the history and management of Stonehenge from both human and environmental and from both regional and global perspectives, and finally to demonstrate the superdisciplinary nature of this microhistorical sustainability situation in a seminal research assignment, which they've just been handed and they're all groaning over. But they have to use various disciplines of humanities, engineering, history, archaeology, sociology, geology, environmental science to underscore the inadequacy of any one disciplinary approach. So I would hope that by the time that they finish this, to understand the systemic and interactional complexity, to use visioning strategies, to propose, evaluate, and discuss alternative sustainable futures, to recognize the validity of different perspectives, to work as part of a team, to propose a defensible theory for the construction of a sustainability model, to explain the role of stakeholder engagement. I'm hoping that they'll get a satisfactory understanding of the undergraduates to reveal how to reveal the systemic and interactional complexity of the sustainability situation that revolves around the history and management of Stonehenge. So in sum, the course is taught using the focus of the SHES approach to sustainability education by revealing the systemic and interactional complexity of a sustainability situation that revolves around the management of Stonehenge. We begin with a presentation of the Salisbury Plain as it is today, go from there to a discussion of how the systemic and interactional complexity of the landscape came about, the relationships and concepts attached to it, and the various forces that impacted its 9,000 years of use. We then come back to the question of what we would like to see happening at Stonehenge, considering the multiple narratives over the past 200 years to justify local and official responses to managing, protecting, and sustaining this landscape. By revealing more and more of the systemic and interactional complexity on just this one place, this one plane, we're hoping that the students become far more familiar with the myriad systemic interactions that determine both the past and the future of sustainability situations. Thank you. All yours, Ira.
Thank you, Kimberly. That was a fascinating presentation, and it really, I think, helped all of us understand the components of the SHES approach and better appreciate exactly how robust the framework is. I know that it was the first time that I've seen the framework applied to a specific course, and not your usual course either. So congratulations with this course and how you've been able to implement the SHES framework. There are a couple of questions that have come in, but I urge others on the line to use the chat box to post a question or a comment. One thing, and also since Paul Baresi has had to leave us early, Kimberly, I'll throw out whatever questions have come up to you, and if others from the SHES Roundtable on the line are able to jump in, that also would be great. So going back to one of the 5 pedagogical strategies that Paul outlined in the first half of this webinar, the first one that caught my attention was framing. And so when my question is, when the SHES Roundtable is using framing as a pedagogical strategy, have you put your own twist on framing, or is it the well-accepted social science notion of framing? And at least from my own experience, I can point to in cultural anthropology, framing as articulated by Irving Goffman, among others. So that would be the first question.
Well, I can only speak to that one from my own experience. I do know that Mike is on the line, and he may be able to do it from a broader point of view. But that's why I originally called this a microhistory, which is a term that we use in history when we are looking at very big issues with a very small subject. And when we frame the sustainability situation at Stonehenge, one might ask, well, this is just one small plane in a rather small country, and Stonehenge itself is a very small monument. Everyone thinks it's something massive. It's not. It's actually a very modest henge. So when I frame it, I'm framing a very limited geography, but the questions that we ask in framing this very limited geography, this very limited sustainability situation, can be applied then to other similar sustainability situations at other megalithic sites in Europe. Anything from the Brúna Boinn in Ireland to the Preseli Mountains sites that have just recently been discovered in Wales, to heading over to Carnac in Brittany. There's an awful lot that can be done by just taking a look at one situation of a place that has seen thousands of years of continued use for ways that we don't quite understand, but it gets us to at least appreciate the complexities of dealing with an environmental situation that cannot simply be viewed from the point of environmental science. You have to take in so many other disciplines. But Mike, you may have another comment on general framing.
I think what I would add, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think what I would add is that Goffman's approach, as I remember it, I mean, I am not deeply into that particular field, but I believe the idea was essentially social construction. You were dealing with social phenomena, and you were working on the social construction of that phenomenon. So you were dealing with political movements, social movements, leaders, things of that sort. That is absolutely part of what we're dealing with, but it's not the only part of what we're dealing with. We are also dealing with the framing of the situation itself from its ecological context, from its topographic context, from its economic context. And in other words, the things that would go into our frame, the things that need to be taken apart, I think go a little bit beyond what I remember Goffman is talking about. But the idea, I mean, the underlying concept is still, I believe, essentially the same concept. We're just going in a much broader swath because ultimately we're looking to work, supradisciplinarily.
Thank you, Kimberly and Mike, for those great answers. There were some comments and questions on some of the other pedagogical strategies that Paul laid out. I got the sense that most were able to grasp systemic resolution and systemic synthesis. A couple of people kind of lost the thread when Paul got to system network mapping and the distinction between systems and categories of systems. And I was hoping that one or both of you might be able to give us a recap of that, just for clarity. We understand that Paul had to run through his slides a little quicker than normal, given an emergency.
Yes, I can deal with that. System network mapping is simply one way to represent that interactional complexity, that systemic complexity of our sustainability situation and our sustainable alternatives that have been developed. And it's a way to do it in systems terms. There is no one correct way to go about it. The network mapping diagram that he showed is one set of graphic conventions. The circles are systems, or the categories of systems that you're working with that you have to break down. And I believe he uses green for environmental systems and orange for more anthropogenic systems. And then he uses arrow thicknesses, pluses and minuses. All that you need is a graphic convention on which a given group of students and the instructor agree upon to understand the different sets of interactions that you're talking about, putting them all in one place. I have done this using hierarchical flowcharts, for example. I still have the remnants of my old reductionistic, aquatic ecology background in me. And so, flowcharts and the like are very useful to me. And I work in quantitative and qualitative modeling methods for resource management. So being able to lay out something for a group of people of all kinds of different backgrounds that is relatively understandable when you look at it is very useful. And any of those things also work. All you need is some means of conveying the interactions of the different systems and subsystems with which you're dealing, in a way that you can see where the primary connections are, where the primary impacts are, where the things are that in one case you need to address, and in another case the things you would want to change toward. The particular diagrammatic method that he showed was the one that he used in his sample courses as he was developing this particular protocol. Kimberly has used a different thing. I've used yet another. It really doesn't matter what it is. You just need some way to map out the system visually so that you can see how all the pieces fit together in order to move forward with deciding how things need to be addressed, adjusted, moved about.
Thanks, Mike. A couple of questions squarely on Kimberly's presentation. I think they're both sort of fundamental and basic. The first is one attendee noted the learning outcome slide that you posted and wanted to know how that might equate to competencies, whether you view those as equivalent or you would translate it into different verbiage from learning outcomes. So I guess that question is the relationship between competencies and learning outcomes. The other question from one attendee, my friend Rod Parnell, is how is a supradisciplinary approach different than a transdisciplinary approach?
Well, I'm going to go with the second one first. This is actually something that the IEA Roundtable has been playing around with for a very long time. And really, we have an entire chapter in the book that examines the differences between disciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, supradisciplinary, and it's best described in the way that let's see, is it Will that does that, Mike?
Yes, it does. There is a difficulty with the terminology, the prefixes. There are Latin ones and Greek ones floating around within the literature, and sometimes the same prefix is used in a different context. We played around with it a while, tried to determine whether or not there was one predominant one. In the end, we ended up sticking, I believe it's with the Latin prefixes, and we lay out the terminology and its meaning very early on. In fact, I talked about it in the first webinar, and in that set of background, trans meaning across would be a bridge, a juxtaposition. So you would be looking at the areas where particular disciplines are connected. Supra is beyond, above. So you're trying to work beyond the traditional boundaries of the specific disciplines. But Dr. Parnell is absolutely correct. It can be difficult navigating through this terminology unless you know what set of terms are being used by a particular individual. That's why we lay it out at the very beginning of our work.
Superdisciplinary gives several of my colleagues a headache because we're trained disciplinarily. Some of us are trained transdisciplinarily, which means that we have 2 or 3 types of discipline under our belt. But to try to combine all of these is absolutely fascinating for both the students and myself. As for the other question that you asked about competencies, this particular course has to satisfy competencies within my department, in that we label it a research-intensive class. And every student in the Department of History has to take 2 of these, in which at the end they have to actually show competencies of development in research, analysis, interpretation, and communication.
Interesting. Okay, well, I'm glad we posed that question to understand the distinction there and the linkage between learning outcomes and competencies. I'm not seeing other questions or comments in the chat box at this point, so I think we've reached a good break point to wrap up. I want to thank both Paul and Kimberly for their presentations, and for Mike, who is also a key player in the SHES Roundtable and presented on the first webinar in this series. As I mentioned, that first webinar is available for you to view in the archived webinar portion of the SEC website at sustainability, curriculumforsustainability.org. And we will be having a third and final installment of this webinar series with the SHES Roundtable next month. And all of you who pre-registered for today's webinar will receive the announcement for that. So with that, I will sign off for today. The recording will be posted in the next couple of days. And thank you all for sticking with us today and for your support of the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. Bye-bye.
Thank you.